speaking of the UK, and we've just been talking about politics there, and we touched on Brexit, there's been a court ruling today which will frustrate many people, because basically what it was suggesting is that the Rwanda plan, Daniel, shouldn't apply to Northern Ireland because it breaches post-Brexit arrangements and specifically the ECHR. What do you make to that?
Well, I think there are two things at the root of this. The first is that when we had the Good Friday Agreement, we put in place a commitment that the European Convention on Human Rights would be something that would be entrenched in Northern Ireland with a view to protecting the rights of people from both major communities.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone sort of objects to that. And shortly afterwards, we had our own Human Rights Act, which applies to Northern Ireland, which took the European Convention and put it into UK law. So the first problem is that this was all done with a view to protecting the rights of the communities in Northern Ireland, and it's now being used, and I would say abused in a sense, to make it more difficult to remove illegal refugees, which was never the intention in the first place. The second part is that, however, that while in the rest of the UK we can change the Human Rights Act, because it's Parliament can change an Act of Parliament, and the Human Rights Act is an Act of Parliament, so it can be changed, it can be overridden. They're now arguing that in Northern Ireland that can't be the case because the post-Brexit arrangements mean that it's embedded in Northern Ireland law because EU law applies there, because we haven't actually completed Brexit, because Northern Ireland is still partly governed by European Union law. The irony of all of this, funnily enough, is that the European Union has resolutely refused to sign the European Convention on Human Rights. So they're actually, it's being imposed on us by the European Union, which won't sign it in the first place. Do you know why?
Why?
Because it would infringe on their sovereignty. And the European Court of Justice has stopped them from signing up to it because it would infringe on European Union sovereignty.
There you go. You can tell all your mates that story down the pub. We'll quiz you on how much of that you paid attention to. What do I tell you all
Good
the time?
stuff. Rerun
it is very interesting stuff. This world is going mad, isn't it? I tell you that all the time. The Liberal Democrats there, they have been accused of deselecting a candidate based on his religion. Yes, many of you guessed that religion right. He is, of course, Christian. This is apparently a breach of equality law. They're going to complain to the ECHR about this. You used to be an advisor for the Lib Dems. I once had the audacity a couple of weeks ago to call you an advisor to Labour, and I very quickly corrected myself. What do you make to this?
Well, I don't know the ins and outs of this particular case, Michelle, and I would suspect that, as with a lot of these things, there may be more behind the scenes that we don't know about. I mean, Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron, former leader of the Liberal Democrats, they are both practising Christians. I mean, Tim Farron resigned because he couldn't equate his Christianity and his faith with the party's policy on gay marriage, or say, same-sex marriage. But what this shows, I think this is a really interesting thing, that I think, in this country have got a very strange relationship with Christianity.
How so?
Because I think we feel slightly uncomfortable about it. There's a certain sort of snobbery. There's a certain sort of I feel a bit uncomfortable about somebody who might be a God botherer or a Bible basher or those sort of things. But we perhaps find it easier to accommodate people of faith where their faith is much more obvious. Maybe they are stricter. Maybe it's because we know about rules on kosher eating, on Muslim food and practices and things like that. And maybe it's because, to a certain extent, the Church of England is quite wishy-washy. It's a lovely church to get married in. We all know the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's a bit sort of Midsummer Murders, if you like. And I'm not sure that when it comes down to real faith and commitment, that we feel comfortable with it. And we do see this quite often cropping up. Tony Blair, or Alistair Campbell on behalf of Tony Blair, famously said, "We don't do God," even though we know that Tony Blair was, a devout Christian.
Daniel?
Well, there are two separate things here, aren't there? The first is there are certain policy issues which traditionally have been regarded as matters of conscience and not party policy. So they would include things like abortion, for example. So is the death penalty or others, where MPs and others have always been allowed to vote according to their conscience, and there hasn't been a party policy. What's happened on the left, the Liberal Democrats in particular, explicitly now make some of these things part of their party policy. So if you're not happy with those things, David Alton, who sits in the House of Lords, was a Liberal Democrat MP. He left the Liberal Democrats years ago over his opposition to abortion because he wasn't allowed to carry on expressing his own conscientious view while still remaining part of a party which now officially supported it. So that's been happening on the left. It hasn't been happening on the... There's no Conservative Party policy that tells you how to vote on abortion, for example. And there are other issues that come in the queue behind that, which might be to do with gay marriage and things like that. That's got nothing necessarily to do with religion, because there are lots of people who are opposed to abortion who are not on religious grounds. And, of course, there are Muslims who are opposed to abortion, just as there are, I'm sure, Hindus and so on. It's not just Christians who are opposed to, practicing Christians who are opposed to abortion. The second question is how we treat Christianity in the public realm. And it's absolutely true, I think. You only have to watch television programmes, dramas and things like that, and that mostly you see that there is a bias against Christianity. There is a sort of sneeringness about Christianity,
but where's that
which is
coming
acceptable.
from?
Well, I think I know where it's coming from. I'll come back to that. Which is acceptable in relation, is accepted in relation to Christianity, but which people would think very carefully about if they were taking the same attitude towards religious practices from other religious practices.
Yeah.
So I think there is an unfair bias in that sense against Christianity. Where is it coming from? I think there's a bunch of people who run our media and so on who personally do sneer at the practice of religion. They think it's mildly...
But do they sneer at religion or do they sneer at Christianity? Because what you're saying is they wouldn't have the audacity to take the mick out of Islam or whatever.
They probably sneer at all religious practice and religious belief, and they think it antediluvian in some ways, even though it's still the case that the vast majority of the world's population actually believes in one religion or another. So they do sneer at it. The point is they wouldn't dare say something that would offend Muslims, not because they're terrified of I'm not saying Muslims would murder them or there'd be fatwas or things like that. I'm not saying that because of the reaction. It's just that they don't feel that they can go into that area yet. I'm sure at some stage they might.
Is it, Daniel? I mean, I
No,
think
it's not new. It goes back at least 20 or 30
I think
years.
it's yes, exactly. I would say sort of 20, 30 years. And actually, you know, if you think about it, most of the time when we, as the general public, if you're not a churchgoer, are exposed to Christianity. So think of the Queen's funeral, for instance, think of the coronation. It's those sort of events, those big sort of set-piece events where you see it. And in a way, it is the ceremonial that people are familiar with rather than the teachings of the Bible or the questions that the Bible raises. I mean, I think it's difficult. The town that I live in, one of the schools there has just told a local vicar thanks very much, but we don't need you coming to the school because we're not having any religious speakers coming into the school. Now, see, I find that quite astonishing because I think, you know, most of us probably grew up in the back of our minds. We know the stories from the Bible, you know, whether it's the Nativity or whether it's, you know, pillars of salt or parting of the Red Sea and all of those sort of things. I mean, we use words and phrases in our everyday language that come from the Bible and stories in the Bible. And I think, you know, it's a bit like Shakespeare. We use phrases all the time that come from Shakespeare without knowing which play they come from. And I think, in a way, if you dilute it, it's a little bit like we are with St George's Day, I think, that we've got this rather uncomfortable embarrassment about it.
I think the question to ask is this. There's a whole set of people who, if you were part of that set and you announced you'd become a Buddhist, people would say, oh, it's really cool, that's really interesting, you know, oh, I never thought about that, and maybe carry on. If you said you'd become an evangelical Christian, they'd think you were completely weird and they wouldn't talk to you again.
I don't know, because that, what's it called, the Alpha Course or whatever it's called, I think that seems to be quite popular. So maybe is there an issue with the branding, the PR, if you would like, of the way that people are promoting that religion, perhaps?
Well, it's interesting about that because, you know, the Alpha Course is popular, and it's popular especially with young people, and they go to it, and then they go back to their jobs. And I wonder how many of them, when they go back to their jobs, actually talk about it. I think they live in two separate worlds. The world of their religious community and the world of work and things like that, where they keep it to themselves, I suspect. I don't think they mix the two.
But do you think that it's because, as I said, that, you know, Anglicanism, in a way, it's easy. You can go to a wedding, you can go to a funeral, but you don't have to go every week but still call yourself a Christian?
Well, you guys are having a conversation amongst yourselves at home. Les on the website says religion and the workplace are separate. We should keep it that way. But Roger replies saying, well, I work in a church, so I'd struggle with that, quite frankly. So there you go. The Lib Dems have responded, I must say as well, and said that this decision about this deselection is apparently undergoing an appeal, so they don't want to comment further at this stage. But they do stress that they are home to people of all faiths and none, including many Christians.